I'm Jason Alari. I'm the Executive Director of the Cumberland County Historical Society. I'd like to introduce Randy, who has become quickly my friend and colleague here at the Historical Society for a lot of the things that he helps us with. Randy was born and raised in Carlisle and joined the fire department in 1970. Over the years, he has served with several of the Carlisle fire companies. He is presently a member of the Union Fire Company and has recently completed a comprehensive history of that organization. As part of the preparation of his book, he did extensive research in the written records of the company and local newspapers. In doing so, he was able to identify a number of interesting trends in the development of the fire company in the town. You might hear about some of those trends today, I'm not sure. Randy resides in Boiling Springs with his wife Laura, who has helped him prepare and publish his earlier books on local railroads and local history. He's co-edited the book, quote, At a Place Called the Boiling Springs, end quote, with Richard Tritt, our photo curator here at the Historical Society, and that was published in 1995. Finally, he's also had a number of articles published in the journal, our CCHS journal, and conducts a walking tour, as I mentioned. So it's my honor to welcome Randy to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Okay. Today I'm going to talk about the early fire companies in Cumberland County. And how many people are here? Anybody here from Sharmanstown? Mechanicsburg? Okay. Newville? Carlisle? Okay. Where else? Anybody from anywhere I didn't name? Nobody from Churchtown or Sharmanstown? Okay. So I'll go ahead and talk about the early fire companies in Cumberland County from 1751 to 1861. And really the first information that I have starts in 1788. Now undoubtedly there were fires before 1788. Just no record survives that I've come across to this point in time to talk about. So what I'm trying to do and what I've been involved in for the last 5 or 8 years is trying to document the development of fire protection in Cumberland County. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that fascinates me in a minute. One of the challenges is there's not a lot of source information. Written records are rather scant. Some of the fire companies maintain minute books, but many of those have been lost. For example, we're lucky at the Union, we have every record back to 1789. One of the Cumberland minute books is around from 1809 to 1861. And some records of other fire companies are around, but over the years, many of those have been lost, so we don't have access to those. In many cases, there's not much information in the newspapers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go. But for the most part, fire companies aren't that interesting to the community. They're kind of blue-collar groups. They're not usually well-placed socially, so they aren't in with the exciting people that write local history. So we many times don't exist in the newspaper. And there's also, in every town, a bias in the newspaper toward the fire company that the editor belonged to. So that in Carlisle, most of the editors came out of the Union. The Union got a lot of front page billing. Very little was written about the other fire companies. In Mechanicsburg, R.H. Thomas, who was the publisher of the paper, was a member of the Rescue Fire Company. They got a lot of top billing. In Sharmanstown, the editor tended to belong to the Cumberland Valley Hose Company. They got a lot of billing, but not so much from the other companies. So it's hard to find. The other thing is that much of what's been written is inaccurate. And I won't say that people fabricate things, but what happens is a lot of times guys at the firehouse tell stories. And I know when I joined the Cumberland Fire Company in 1970, there were some old guys. They would be the equivalent of my age now. And they would tell stories, and we would hear those stories, and we would come to believe them. Well, eventually somebody would write down one of those stories, and it would appear in print, and then it would be cited in future generations. So a lot of those stories were inaccurate. One example, just as a quick example, is Charles Leeds, who was an attorney who lived in Washington, D.C., but grew up in Carlisle, wrote a series of letters home as part of the Old Home Week ceremonies in 1909. That was the 100th anniversary of the Cumberland Fire Company. And he gave some names of the founders of the Cumberland Fire Company. Well, they were actually people that founded the Union Fire Company 20 years earlier. And he said they bought this fire engine from Philadelphia, from the Diligent Fire Company. It was one of the greatest engines ever manufactured. Well, they never bought that engine. The Goodwill bought that engine. But those stories get repeated. So a lot of it's inaccurate. As I said, a lot is incomplete. So it's a little bit of a challenge. I have to acknowledge some people, and I do this very quickly, but the whole idea for what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to document fire protection in every community in Cumberland County from the start of the county to current. And that idea came from a gentleman by the name of Jake Heisey, who said, you know, I always wished I could have done this. I thought it would be interesting. And my first reaction was, that's kind of a crazy idea. Who would be interested in that? Wonder if there's anything to cover. Well, turns out Jake had a pretty good idea. And there's, I think, 5 or 6 people in the known universe that find the topic interesting. They're listed here. Brad Myers is a local historian who's done a lot to help me. Dave Halcyon, Greg Stapleton, Mike Snyder, Beth Bone, and everybody on the staff here. I come in here quite a bit and I ask for quite a lot, so thank those guys. But this is kind of the genesis of the ideas. So as I started to put this together, I thought, you know, who cares? Is this important? Why would we care about fire companies? Why would we care about the development of fire companies in our county or our community? And as I thought about that question, I realized that the fire companies are symptomatic of the growth and development of the United States. We hear a lot now of our declining and decaying infrastructure. There was a time when we didn't have any infrastructure in America. We built that. And the fire companies were part of that infrastructure. And in most cases, the fire companies built the fire protection systems that we have in each community. That's typically done by a small group of people. Not always people that have a lot of training in developing an organization or an infrastructure, but they built it so that the fire companies reflect the growth of our towns, they reflect the increasing complexity of our towns, and they reflect the community response to a community problem, that fire being the problem. They also reflect adaptations to a changing fire environment and a complicated fire environment. I'll give you an example. Right now, we're all used to 911, right? And we call 911 and what happens? Magically, resources come and they solve our problem. Any problem we have can be solved by 911. And one of the big systems that's behind 911 is the EMS system. So when you call 911 and the ambulance comes, there's a highly trained group of people there that are ready to provide help. That system started in little firehouses all across Cumberland County, mostly in the 1930s. And it tied into the fact that hospitals until the 1930s weren't places you went for treatment, they were places you went till you died. And as they started to develop hospitals into treatment centers, then they needed ways to transport the people. So initially transport to the hospital was done by the local undertaker. And as that proved less and less satisfactory, or the demands became higher and higher, local volunteer firemen would say, we ought to have an ambulance. They organized an ambulance service, and that eventually led to the EMS system that we have now. So when we talk about the fire companies, what we're watching are small groups of people that recognize problems, recognize risk, and they develop strategies to control and manage that risk. And also the fire companies represent the social capital, kind of the strength of our communities at any given time, based on the networks that occurred within the communities. So that's why I think these things are interesting. A little bit of another preparation work here. When is fire a problem to a community? When is fire a problem to a community? Well, when it's dry, when it happens, here's the way we assess community risk. If your house catches on fire, you have a problem. If your house sets the neighbor's house on fire, they have a problem. If your house is on fire and it threatens my house, we have a problem. Fire becomes a community problem only when the community becomes big enough that other people's buildings can set my building on fire. If your building can't set my building on fire, it's not a problem. Unless it's my house that's burning, then we have a problem. So as we look at fire protection, I think that's kind of a big role. And even today, when we try and fund the fire service, the feedback that we get is, you're asking for too much money. This is only really important if the fire is going to spread from one building to another. and endanger parts of the community. If it's just one building that's insured, that's not that terribly important to us. Now, it's not articulated quite that way, but it's the only way I can think or summarize the thinking that we encounter at the governmental level. So, this is a pretty stylized picture, but here we have a community problem, right? It spread from one building into a second building and can spread to others. Now a community will realize we ought to have a fire department. That seems kind of counterintuitive, but it's typically this kind of situation that causes a community to form a fire company. And that's why there was a delay. Carlisle, for example, was formed in 1751. It took to 1789 to have the first fire company because we didn't have the first fire that burned down 5 or 6 buildings till 1788. And then when we had that building, everybody became motivated and said, wow, we ought to do something. Okay, so one thing that I think makes this history important is the fact that we're coming to the end of volunteer fire service in the United States. It's changing relatively quickly, and I think it's important that we look at it. All right, so let's move in. I hope I can make this a little more interesting and exciting, but early fire protection. You know, when we look at Carlisle in the early years, or any community in the early years, fire protection was an individual responsibility. And we didn't have water, we didn't have hydrant systems. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So when there was a fire, who was responsible for my building? I was. Most houses didn't have running water, but they would have some quantity of water. They'd usually go to a well probably in the morning, fill several containers, take them back, and use that water for the rest of the day. So we had an incipient fire. A lot of times there was water there, but they could immediately apply water to control the fire. If not, then we had to go to a bucket brigade, and that was an interesting process in and of itself. But fire protection was an individual responsibility, and it became a group responsibility if something caught fire. So, here's what a fire might look like in colonial days before we organized the fire company. One thing to our advantage at this point in time is fires didn't burn differently, but houses were built differently, and there were a lot less contents, and we didn't have plastics. And nearly every account of fire that we read in the 1800s, even into the early 1900s, is the first thing they would do would take all the contents out of the building. Not that they were pessimistic. Where was the value? Many times it was in the contents. So they would take the contents of the house out. Now, a common problem was that they'd take the contents out of the house, and then they would be stolen. And that's frequent, okay? Or they would so destroy the contents in the process of getting them out of the building, there was nothing left. So a lot of challenges. But the solution to this, of course, was fire companies, where groups of people joined together to obtain improved technology. And when I talk technology for early fire companies, what are we talking? What do you think high-tech fire protection was back in the late 1700s, early 1800s? Buckets. So one of the first requirements when they formed the early fire companies was every member had to have 2 buckets with their name on. Mechanicsburg actually passed a law that every house was to have 2 buckets. That was technology. The other technology was the engines that we'll talk about. And then they developed engines that could take suction or draft water out of cisterns or wells. That was pretty high tech. That didn't come to some areas, although it was perfected in the early 1800s. For example, Sharmanstown didn't get a suction engine until 1860. And you'll see that a lot in the Cumberland Valley, that a new idea is spawned, say fire hose, in 1800 in Philadelphia, and we don't get fire hose in Carlisle till 1835. That was only 35 years. That wasn't bad. The fire alarm system, the street boxes, were perfected about 1855. We didn't get the first ones of those in Carlisle until 1896. Okay? So there's always a little technology delay. The other thing, as I talked on there in terms of technology, was hose. But the fire companies at this point in time still needed public assistance to form the lines to do the bucket brigade, which was a pretty interesting process. And as they started to organize, they tried to structure things, but the wild card was the bucket brigade. One of the more interesting stories of a fire in Carlisle was a fire in 1820 over on Pomfret Street, about where the Carlisle Arts Learning Center is. And they formed a bucket brigade that went to the Latort Creek. It's about 2 blocks away. And who do you think staffed the bucket brigade that night? The women and children of the town. Many men stood back with their arms crossed and watched them relay water for 2 blocks with buckets. So there were some issues even with the bucket brigades that they were challenged. Okay, so now we have the fire company, and here we have all this technology. They have a fire engine. In this case, they have hose, they have ladders, they have nozzles. Perfect world? What are we still lacking in the scenario here? Water supply. Water supply. Now, I said that Carlisle was started in 1750. When do you think Carlisle got a water system and got fire hydrants? 1854. When do you think Shippensburg got hydrants and a water system? 1886. When do you think Newville got hydrants and a water system? 1894. Okay? So, again, there were a lot of challenges. We didn't have water. The largest fire in Carlisle occurred in 1851 before the water system came and burned down 45 buildings between North Street, Bedford Street, High Street, and East Street, or East Lowther Street. So even though we had the fire companies, many times they weren't effective or couldn't be effective because they didn't have the water supply. Okay, so why do fire companies form? Well, I talked about the big fire. We'll see other companies today. The initial fire company would go inactive, so there would be another fire company formed. In some cases, Group A didn't get along with Group B, so Group B would go start their own fire company. When hydrant systems came and growth and complexity. So here's what an old-time fire engine looked like. This would be about 1840s vintage, 1860s vintage. There'd be 16 people on the hand engine, on the brakes, and they would pump up and down, and that moved pistons, which discharged the water. If they were working the brakes, they would do 60 strokes a minute, where the levers would go up and down about 60 times a minute, once every second. And a person could work for about 10 minutes on the brakes. So very labor-intensive. It was a little bit tricky, too, to swap the guys in and out without getting hurt. A lot of times at fires, you'll read accounts where people have foot injuries or arm injuries or hand injuries because they got hurt operating the engines. What would motivate a person to want to do that? Why would people do that? And that was one of the challenges. A lot of times, as we'll see when we start to get into specific towns, the fire company would form, and it would be active for a couple months, maybe a couple years, and then it would become inactive. Then there'd be another fire, and they'd regenerate, and they'd become inactive. We had at that point in time maybe 2 or 3 fires a year in a town like Carlisle. Now they run 1,000 calls a year. There just wasn't enough activity, there wasn't enough challenge, enough motivation to keep people really active. So let's talk about why did the firemen do it? Well, initially, I think they were altruistic. They wanted to help people. But we'll see a shift as time goes on. How many of us remember parades in the old days? Not parades in today's world, but parades in the old days when they used to mean something. Well, it used to be the group that had the parade was one of the controlling groups, and they had power in the community, and that's why they were able to have the parade. So when we look at the history of parades, and I'll use Carlisle as an example because most of us are from there, but through the 1840s into the early 1850s, most of the parades that were held in town were held on behalf of the militia companies, the soldiers, the local troops. By the 1850s, the fire companies take over control of the parades, and from 1850 until 1909, the fire companies were the lead organizations in the town. They were some of the most powerful groups, some of the most influential groups. They start to wear uniforms in the 1850s. I'll show you some examples. They start to build firehouses that become social organizations, and they start to become very dynamic groups. And they shift from being purely altruistic, where the goal was to help other people, to now where we have a lot of other goals that our organization helps us achieve, personal goals and group goals. And it kind of changes a little bit some of the social capital. And the reason I said 1909 was Old Home Week. And if you've been around Carlisle, you've heard of Old Home Week. That was the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the Cumberland Fire Company. They had 2 parades that week to celebrate the fire company. The first was the Industrial and Manufacturers Parade on Monday night, because now the manufacturers, the businessmen, the industrialists were in charge of the town. They had the fire company parade on Wednesday night. 15,000 people came to see the industrial parade, maybe 5,000 came to see the fireman parade. And that was the point at which the firemen had kind of lost their social status. Now, of course, the people that control the parades are the car show. Sorry, I didn't say that. But anyway, so the fire companies do kind of morph a little bit, and as we go through that. Now, by the mid-1850s, and everybody's seeing the Courier knives, prior to about the 1850s, many times there'd be a fire in town, and the newspaper would be highly critical of the fire department. And they would suggest one of two things. We either need to, and this would be after a fire, A, organize a fire department, or teach the one we have what to do and ask that they please in the future not tear down all the neighboring buildings. Very negative, very harsh, very critical. But by the 1850s now, the newspapers start to shift and they become highly complimentary of the firemen. The firemen have become romanticized and the image changes, as does their status. It's kind of an interesting process. Now, one question that comes to my mind, and something that parallels this, is at the same time that the fire companies kind of ascend to the social status in the town, and they start to become dominant organizations, the OddFellows arrive. In virtually every community in the mid-1840s, the OddFellows come to town. Now, the OddFellows were a group that did good deeds or altruistic deeds, and they wanted to be anonymous. They didn't seek any recognition. The fire companies, too, were altruistic, but they loved recognition. So I'm not sure if there was common membership between the two groups, between the firemen and the OddFellows, but there were a lot of parallels between the OddFellows and the firemen. And I'd like to do some more research and try and find out, did the OddFellows and the firemen both form at the same time because of the same social forces, or did one motivate the other? Did they become competitive and that's what drove them? Well, when we look at the OddFellows, they're very much like fire companies. They wore uniforms, they had a lot of regalia, they had a lot of rituals, they had parades, they had conventions, they built large buildings. History on High is in the OddFellows building. Two very parallel organizations. The only thing is the OddFellows didn't have fire engines, but they did all the other same things. So it's kind of interesting to watch at that point in time some of the development. So again, just trying to set the context for where we're at. So we'll take a quick look at some of the early fire companies. Again, these are all pre-Civil War. One town that's not listed here is New Cumberland. New Cumberland developed very early as 1803, and they had fires, but they never formed a fire company before the Civil War. But there was one very interesting fire in New Cumberland in the 1830s. Large mill caught fire. Some firemen in Harrisburg saw the mill fire from across the river. They didn't know what it was. They saw that it was a big fire. So they loaded their hand fire engine on a barge and took it to New Cumberland to help fight the fire, which was pretty much out till they got there. It's the only time that I'm aware of that a barge was ever used in any fire operation in Cumberland County. You got to remember that New Cumberland was a port town at that point in time. Okay, so Carlisle had 6 fire companies that I'll touch on, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these. This, again, before the Civil War, so the Friendship Fire Company came after the 1900s. The Union Fire Company was the result of a fire in Halloween 1788 on North Hanover Street, in the area where the vault is. 5 or 6 houses burned down, and the property owners of the town came together. They bought a fire engine that arrived in April, and on April 6, 1789, the Union Fire Company was organized. About 70 founding members. They were the well-to-do of the community. You had to be a property owner. Of course, there were other restrictions on membership. And they bought the fire engine. The town actually bought the fire engine. They put it in a little shed on the square near where the Civil War monument is. And they drilled periodically. They became inactive by 1807. And they reorganized in 1819. I'll touch on that when I get to the Cumberland. They were located, in 1821, the Cumberland and the Union Fire Companies built a 2-story town hall near the square. It's pictured on the sidewall here, which isn't lit right now, but it would be, if you're standing facing the Soldiers Monument, it would be over probably in the area of the bank drive-through, in the alley. And there were two stories. The first floor was the firehouse, the second floor was the town hall. It also had a restroom, which was part of the reason that they built the building. The commissioners of the county funded it for the protection and the relief of the community. And part of the way they raised the money was the fact they agreed to put a restroom in it for the courthouse. But in any event, that was there till 1845. In March of 1845, that was set on fire. There were 4 fire engines and 2 hose carriages on the first floor, and somebody lashed all those things together and then set it on fire. Until it was all said and done, all but 1 fire engine, there were 4 in there, all but 1 burned. It was damaged, it couldn't be used. The town hall burned down, the fire spread to the courthouse. The courthouse burned down, and fortunately didn't spread to the rest of the town. So in 1845, the Union moved over to West Lather Street, across the street from where they're at now, and built a firehouse in 1859. That was our first fire company in Carlisle. Their first engine would have probably looked something like this, hand-operated. There's a tub there that you put water in. There's 2 cylinders in it. It's kind of like a water pistol. When you pump the handles, that moves the pistons. That made water discharge. that would flow maybe 30, 40 gallons of water if it's full and everybody's really working. You get a couple of the old guys on it, might only flow 20 gallons, you know, but pretty primitive, right? The town, the construction wasn't that much different than what we have now, although there was no water other than what came from the wells. After the fire in 1845, they got a new and improved model. This is an 1845, this isn't the Union's engine, but similar to what they got. This would probably flow 200 gallons of water. It would take 16, 17, 18 people to operate. Each person's about a quarter of a horsepower, maybe a third of a horsepower for a short period of time when they're pumping the engine. So it's about the equivalent of a 4 horsepower lawnmower engine is how much they could pump. Fairly primitive. Again, we had to keep it full of water. They did eventually, when they get the hydrants, they were able to put water in it and use the pump that way. But fairly primitive equipment when we consider that by the Civil War, Carlisle was a town of about 7,000 to 8,000 people, and it didn't look too dissimilar to what you see when you walk around the center part of town now. So that was the Union. This is their 1859 fire hall on the left. And you can see it's a rather elaborate structure. The second floor was a meeting room and a lounge. Now the firemen started to hang out here, and they did all sorts of things. Socially, they paraded. They would gather on Christmas Day and have smokers. Good way to get out of the house. On Thanksgiving Day, they'd go to the firehouse, and they'd go visit another fire company, maybe in Harrisburg or Chambersburg. Again, a good way to get out of the house. And became very active organizations. Now we have uniforms, and we march, and we do a whole bunch of things. And if we look at the pictures of the firehouse, each one that's built seems to get a little more elaborate, a little bit bigger than the last one. So it becomes kind of competitive between the fire companies. Now, at one point in time, at the start of the Civil War, there's 4 fire companies in Carlisle, and they're located almost within sight of each other. And a lot of people commented, we ran those firehouses into the 1980s, 1990s. People comment, why were the firehouses so close together? Everything was hand-pulled until 1910. Okay, Carlisle got fire horses in 1910. The first car caught fire in Carlisle in 1905. The first airplane landed in Carlisle in 1910. And we got horses to pull our fire trucks in 1910. Most cities had started to use fire horses in the 1870s. But in any event, that's the Union story. The Cumberland Fire Company was a result of a fire in January of 1809 down by the creek. 2 houses, or a house burned, 2 people died, another person was pretty severely burned. Because the Union was inactive, it was decided we needed another fire company in town, so they formed the Cumberland. They ordered an engine, it came from Philadelphia, it arrived in 1810. They were housed with the Union until 1845. The Cumberland and the Union went together and built the town hall in 1821. In 1845, after the town hall burned, the Cumberland moved over to South Bedford Street. The Stewart Law Center is the old Cumberland Firehouse, and they operated out of that building until 1896. But again, you can see it's a fairly elaborate building. That building has a cast iron front, which is kind of unique. The bell tower is not there anymore, but the bell tower was a prominent feature on many of the firehouses. That was how the town was alerted to fires. When there was a fire, you'd go to the firehouse, ring the bell. That would cause a lot of commotion in the town. The firemen would run to the firehouses or to the fire, and that was our 911 system of the day. Everybody was pretty happy up until the 1890s that if within a half hour of the time we discovered a fire, the fire department got on the scene. Half hour. I guarantee you, if we waited a half hour now to get on the scene, we'd lose half the town. Okay, now we shoot for 90% of the time to be there within 10 minutes. 1834, there was a fire. It didn't go well. The papers were very critical. A lot of people got upset. So they formed another fire company. Nobody wrote the name down. The paper says the new fire company met last night. The minutes of the Union say so-and-so, and then they left blank spaces from the so-and-so left blank spaces fire company, resigned to join. You know, that kind of thing. So we know one form. We have no idea what it was called, who was in it, or anything. But it was there for a brief period of time in 1834, and it went away. This next group is pretty interesting. 1841, the Alert Fire Company forms. Now, I don't know about the Cumberland Fire Company. The Union Fire Company, as I said, in order to be a member, you had to be a property owner. And that was an exclusionary tool that was done for a purpose. I won't go there. But the Cumberland Fire Company, I'm not sure whether you had to be a property owner to get in that fire company or not. But they wouldn't allow people to join the fire companies that were less than 21 years old. So, in 1841 in Carlisle, all the young mechanics of the town, the blue-collar working guys, the newspapers called them muscle and sinew, which is a polite term for laboring people, band together, formed the Alert Fire Company, and they borrowed a fire engine from the Cumberland Fire Company. And for the next 2 or 3 years, they were very active. They were, of course, the youngest guys, the most aggressive. They did the best job when they went to fires. They were the first organization in Carlisle to wear uniforms and march, and they had a banner, and they were gung-ho, but they couldn't get any money to buy their own firehouse or buy their own fire engine. At some point in time, there was some bad blood between them and the Cumberland that had loaned them their fire engine, and the Alert kind of walked away and decided they were in the process of merging with the Union Fire Company. So here we have this group of upstart youngsters that have this brand new fire company that can't get along with anybody, that's just kind of been thrown out of the existing organization. And right as that happens, I'll be darned if the town hall doesn't catch fire, and that's when the fire trucks were tied together, and that's when the fire trucks were destroyed. I don't know that there's a connection or not. Actually, I have another person in my mind that's the suspect. But was it just coincidence, or was it, real drama? But some of the people from the Alert, after that fire company ended, went back into the Union Fire Company. It's pretty exciting stuff, isn't it? See what I mean about 5 or 6 people in the known universe really get into this? Okay. Now, Carlisle got a hydrant or water system in 1854. The last fire before the water system was turned on was over at Pomfret and Pitt, the Handel fire. 7 buildings burned. Fortunately, the whole town didn't burn, but we got the hydrant system. And as soon as we got the hydrant system, the Union Fire Company recognized the need to buy a new hose carriage, so they had a bunch of fundraising activities, and they got enough money together to buy a new hose carriage. And then, whoops, I think I did what I didn't want to do there, Richard. The union raised all this money for the hose carriage, and then a group of members of the union took the money and formed the Goodwill Fire Company and bought a hose carriage. Those rascals. And the Goodwill turned out to be kind of the most progressive organization in the town. They built the first firehouse, they had the first steamer, they had the first fire horses, and it caused them to go bankrupt in 1907. So they were very progressive, but it did in fact cost them. Here's what a hose company would have looked like with the hose carriage, maybe 800-900 feet of hose. Hose at the time was made out of leather, riveted together with copper, and it was very difficult to maintain, not terribly reliable. But here we see a typical volunteer fire company response, 30, 40 guys on the ropes, pulling, racing to get to a fire. What motivates these guys? What motivates these guys is to get to the fire first and get first water, to beat the other company in. Now what would happen eventually is the big full-size reels were kind of heavy. So you know what the union did? They went out and got a real light hose reel, because the rule was the first company that got there got the hydrant. Didn't matter if somebody else came that could use it before. If you got there first, you could hold the hydrant. So they had a thing, they called it the snatcher. It was a real light 2-wheeled hose carriage, and they could run real fast with 1 or 2 guys and get there and sit on the hydrant. They didn't always play fair. But they would get first water. Even if it took their steamer a half hour to get there, they got the best hydrant. So these guys were motivated by the desire to get there first and beat the other guys. This would have been kind of a loud, raucous event, kind of interesting, keeping in mind that that carriage probably weighs 3,000 or 4,000 pounds with a hose on it. And it became very difficult to pull. The steamers, and they were hand-pulled till 1910 for the most part, they weighed about 6,000 pounds. So it took a lot of volunteers to pull, and that's why you see so many firehouses. The people came out of the neighborhoods, we needed the people to do that. This was Carlisle's first firehouse, 1857. This is the Goodwill. It's now the Salvation Army thrift store. They ran out of that until 1870, and the building is now Churchtown Bank. Was their second firehouse. They actually ran a steamer out of here. The front portion is the original firehouse. The second floor is their lounge. People can now hang out there. There's a disease we call, and when a person joins the fire company, especially a young person, they tend to be very enthusiastic. Gung-ho, is the word. And they catch a disease, we call it firehouse fever. You just want to be at the firehouse all the time in case there's a call. So there's the social hall and the hanging out and all those social aspects. And that starts in the 1850s. And from the 1850s forward in Carlisle, if you walked into a firehouse, I'm comfortable to say, since 1857, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, there's probably somebody in that firehouse waiting for a call. Even though at that point in time, they probably ran 3 or 4 calls a year, they still hung out. So that's where we start to see the fire companies. Now again, they reflect the social capital, kind of the energy, the commitment that the town has to its protection. This is the Goodwill's hand engine. This is a used engine purchased out of Philadelphia. And it's in operation. It's the only action shot we have of a hand steam fire or hand fire engine in Cumberland County. It's over on West High Street. But just to give you an idea of what they look like, who they were, and you'll notice in all these pictures, everybody's skinny. That changes with time. 1859 in Carlisle, the Empire Hook and Ladder was formed. Buildings have now gotten more complex. They were higher, they were longer. They had ladders initially, even when the Union formed, they kept the ladders in a shed downtown. The problem was that somebody needed a ladder, they'd go get the ladder, they couldn't take it back, so when they had a fire, they never had a ladder that they needed. The Empire built a wooden firehouse diagonally across the street over here on Dickinson Avenue, and they were there until 1870. So that's kind of Carlisle. That's their hand ladder truck that was bought in Philadelphia in 1859, came to Carlisle. They tried to give it away, they tried to throw it away, and it never went away. They still have it, in spite of the fact. So the secret to historic preservation is don't try and save it, and you can afford to do that. Mechanicsburg, kind of a strange story. Interesting little town. It's amazing that Mechanicsburg never burned down. Mechanicsburg is probably our most burned community in all of Cumberland County. And very poorly funded, very poorly supported from a fire protection standpoint, historically. Mechanicsburg was settled about 1806. The first fire company that we found reference to there is the Pilot Fire Company, organized about 1830. 2 or 3 local people, including Fred Wunderlich, who owned the local tavern, bought a used fire engine from somewhere, no idea. It was called the Pilot Engine number 3. We have no idea where it came from. It was recognized by the borough of Mechanicsburg, and they provided fire protection through at least 1848. Here again, they formed, then they faded, then they came back, and they formed. Haven't been able to find any records of fires, but we know the fire company was there. By 1848, they had built a 2-story firehouse on South Market Street, and I have a map shot of that in a minute. And in 1848, they bought a second engine, a hand engine called the Citizens. They bought it from a guy in Milton, Pennsylvania, by the name of Mr. Hurst. And that Citizens engine was there until the Washington Fire Company was formed in 1858. Mechanicsburg got fire hydrants in 1858, and then they bought a new engine to take advantage of the fire hydrants. So again, the Pilot initially had a firehouse on South Market Street and Stauffer Avenue, where the parking lot to the bank is, like the PNC parking lot would be where that firehouse was. Then later across the street about where Civil War and War is, in that area, another one was built. In 1848, they built a 2-story firehouse, and that stayed in operation when the Washington Fire Company formed. They moved in there as well. There you can see the town hall. The cross street there is Stauffer Avenue. Main Street would be to the north, and the town hall and firehouse was there from 1848 to 1860. Oops, I'm going backwards. In 1848, again, that Citizens engine came. Whether or not there was a Citizens Fire Company or not, I don't know, but they replaced the Pilot engine. Then in 1858, the Washington Fire Company was formed. And here's probably the most incorrect history that's published in all of the county is the Washington Fire Company. The Washington Fire Company's history says that it's very confusing what's published. And I'm not faulting the fire company here, it's another author. But they indicate that they organized on Washington's birthday. And forever since they've been known as the Washington Fire Company. Well, that's not true. They organized once before Washington's birthday. It was a used fire engine called the Washington, which is why they call it the Washington Fire Company. They didn't meet on George Washington's birthday when they said they did. Their minute books even say that they didn't meet that day. They did take the engine out, and the group of Carlisle people from the Cumberland went down and showed them how to use it. Their history says they perfected their organization that day. Well, yeah, they learned how to use their fire engine. But they swear, they have their banquet every year around George Washington's birthday because that's when they organize. It's not when they organize. But you see where I'm coming from here? How myth becomes the truth. And it's kind of interesting. They built a 3-story building at their present site in 1868. It was very cheaply built and started to fall down, and then they tore it down in 1907 and built their new station. Their history says that they're still in their 1860 firehouse. They're not. That firehouse was featured in Girl Interrupted, the movie. It has a cameo appearance in there. This is a picture of their Washington fire engine. And this is an interesting story. They bought this engine in 1858. The town did, the borough bought it. They replaced it in 1870. It was old and worn out. In 1876, they sold it to New Kingstown. It was in New Kingstown until 1877, or I'm sorry, 1879, at which time it was sold to Newville. And for a number of years, Newville had a Washington Fire Company because they had the Washington engine. So that's kind of interesting. Again, notice how thin everybody is. Must be lens distortion. Shippensburg is another town that it has quite an interesting history. There's some indication there might have been a fire company there as early as 1817. The first reference we have is to the Shippensburg Fire Company in 1830, and then there's several fire companies that come after that. The Vigilant is believed to have formed in 1843. They have no records, but on their bell, it says that they organized in 1843, so that's the date that they say they organized. Again, how accurate that is, we don't know. A lot of ups and downs. They would be active for a couple months, be inactive for a couple of years, reorganize, come back. A lot of reasons for that. They used an old engine called the Rocket. It was probably built in the 1700s. In the 1840s, one of their reorganizations, they bought a used engine from the Hibernia Fire Company in Philadelphia. And the only new fire engine that Shippensburg Borough bought in the first 200 years of its existence was purchased in 1860. Shippensburg is a poor town, is the only conclusion I can come to, and I have some materials we wrap up here in a minute or two that we'll talk about that. This is the council chambers in Shippensburg. The Vigilant Fire Company operated out of this building from 1843 to 1929. Yeah. Crummy looking building, no place for the firemen. Remember I said in Carlisle they had the parlors and the day rooms and the guys hung around and they were very active? Shippensburg never did that. They didn't allow the firemen to hang out here. Newville prohibited their firemen from hanging out in the firehouse. And as a result, the organizations never got strong. So, again, that's kind of what you're looking at. They put a bell in the building, but the building was so unstable that they had to engineer a way to ring it that it didn't cause the building to collapse. It's that true story. And a lot more goes on in Shippensburg, but that was the Vigilant Fire Company. At the same time that the Vigilant formed in the 1840s, there was another fire company, the Alert, and the Alert in Shippensburg was also the young rebel, kind of rough guys. And they also had a fire company. We're not quite sure where, but I'll get to them in a minute. Here's the Hibernia engine. Now the Hibernia, which is an Irish group, in Philadelphia had a 4-story building, and it's kind of typical of what the big city volunteer fire companies were like in the 1840s, 1850s. And as they would buy new apparatus, it would filter out into the hinterland. And a lot of apparatus that we had in Cumberland County in the early part of the century, the 1700s, 1800s, came from Philadelphia. So this was hand-me-down, worn-out city stuff that came to Shippensburg. As I say, this is the first and only new fire engine that the borough of Shippensburg bought in 200 years. Kind of interesting. The Alert was, again, the young guys. They got the hand-me-down engine from the Vigilants. It was a little thing like this, what we call a coffee grinder, where instead of pumping the handles up and down, you crank them. And they got so disgusted with this thing and so frustrated with it, so angry at council that they went to a fire one night, and after they put the fire out, they destroyed their fire engine. Then they went out of existence. And the council fined some of the guys. It was a pretty ugly situation, apparently. But the Alert was kind of short-lived. They did go into the Cumberland Valley when they formed. I'll talk about them. Now, I said in 1859, Carlisle organized the Hook and Ladder Company, the Empire. Shippensburg organized the Niagara Hook and Ladder Fire Company in 1859. It existed for one article in a newspaper, and that's all it's ever been seen of. They'll have another ladder company formed down there in the 1800s. They were a little bit slow, but in case anybody ever asked you, now you know about the Niagara Hook and Ladder. The Cumberland Valley Hose Company formed in 1859, 2 years after the Alert destroyed their fire engine. It looks like a lot of the people that were in the Alert went into the Cumberland Valley Hose. They were located on Main Street by the Branch Creek in a little building across from the current Cumberland Valley Hose Company building. And later went on to become one of the leading fire companies in Shippensburg. Quite active, but that takes us up to 1859. That's what their second engine looked like that was purchased for them in 1877. That's about an 1847 vintage engine that was protecting Shippensburg from 1877 to the point that they motorized in 1923. It is amazing that Shippensburg never burned down. Newville, perhaps the most complex and confusing story of all the towns in the valley. There have probably been a dozen fire companies in Newville. I'm only going to touch on two here pretty briefly, but the first is an engine called the Juno that came to town sometime in 1834. And I think you've ever heard that Who's on First routine? Abbott Costello. I just picture, you know, like the Juno. Do you know the fire company in Newville? Yeah, the Juno. No, like anyway, you see where I'm coming. I have a firehouse story that I can't really tell because I'd have to clean it up too much. It wouldn't be funny. But I was asked one time in the firehouse by a fireman from Newville, what does the word triumph mean? Somebody had used the word triumph. And the guy didn't know what it meant, so I explained it. And basically he said, gee, you're smarter than Juno, or smarter than Google. So I'm assuming that the name Juno was probably given to the fire engine before it got to Newville. Juno is a word from either Roman or Greek mythology that is the female protector of the community, or protectress. And I just can't see anybody in the Newville Fire Company coming up with that name on their own. They had a Dalmatian dog, they called it Bruco. The fire truck was made by Bruco, so they named the dog Bruco. You know, I would have thought they would have called it Spot or something, but I have family from Newville, so although I'm not from Newville, I don't feel bad picking on Newville. But the Juno fire engine arrived in Newville about 1830. 1834, we see reference to a Newville Fire Company. That organization, or that engine, wore out, and in 1843 they went to York and they bought an engine from the Resolution Fire Company in York. I think the Resolution Fire Company had bought it from the Resolution Fire Company in Philadelphia. They say it's built in 1828, I think it's built in 1821. But in any event, when the Resolution comes to town, the firehouse was a shed located in the area of the school, which is the current firehouse in Newville. At some point, that was moved to the Leitner residence on Main Street. I'm not sure where that is, but they built a wooden firehouse, probably a two-story. It was a portable building, and at some point in time in the 1840s, they moved that building from Main Street back to the school grounds. And they kept the Juno hand engine, they kept the Resolution hand engine. For a while, they kept the town cannon in that building. I never realized that Newville had their own cannon, but they kept it there. Eventually, they started to build a new firehouse at 16 East Main Street. It's now a beauty shop, it still exists. While they're building it, which took 2 years, the wooden firehouse at the old school building was set on fire and was destroyed. And in that fire, the Juno fire engine was destroyed. Whether the Resolution engine was saved from the burning building or if the Resolution had been moved to the other station, I don't know. But after the fire, then they moved into the firehouse on East Main Street. It was originally built to be the fire hall on the first floor and council chambers on the second floor. It took them about 12 or 15 years to get enough money to put the furniture in the second floor to have town council meet there. So for a while, it was just the fire company. Once they put the town hall in, then they wouldn't let the firemen in the second floor. So they had no hangout place, so the fire company became inactive. So by 1858, we're in the new firehouse. In 1859, one of the old warehouses in Newville burned, and they went and they bought an engine called the Pet. It was from the Independent Fire Company in Baltimore, made in Philadelphia, and that came to Newville in 1859. That would stay there until into the 1890s when it was sold, but that brings us up to the First World War. But at one time, after the war, there were one, possibly two, maybe three fire companies in the old South Ward, the old Newtown portion of Newville. There were an Independent Fire Company, a Friendship Fire Company, the Washington that I mentioned before, and also a Hope Fire Company that formed in Newville over the years, as well as the Friendship Fire Company and then the Friendship Hose Company. So for a little town of not too many people and not much money, they have a pretty storied history. This is the Resolution engine. It still exists. It's still in Newville, probably built in 1821. One of only two like it in the world that survive in the world. A very unique design. It's called a hydraulion. It has a horizontal pump as opposed to a vertical pump, and it also has a hose reel on the top. So it's a pretty innovative piece. The people that built this, Sellers and Pennock, were the same people that perfected fire hose in 1800. And they learned how to lap the leather over and rivet the hose, and they did a lot of different innovative things. So it's kind of a unique engine, and as I say, it's still in Newville. They have quite a little museum up there worth a trip up to see. You notice how thin everybody is. Newville's old firehouse, at one time it had a pretty elaborate bell tower on it. The bell was quite an issue. The first bell they got, they rang it, it sounded so horrible, they sent it back, which wasn't uncommon, and a lot of controversy with that. Now the odd town here is Churchtown. And I'll tell this story for the benefit of everybody, but I don't know why Churchtown has a fire company. Churchtown, when it was started in 1860, 59, 60, just a little town, very small population. If they had a fire, I haven't been able to find it, but they decided they needed a fire company, and they organized a fire company, the Union Fire Company in Churchtown, or the Churchtown Union Fire Company, and they buy a fire engine and build a firehouse. This was the Churchtown firehouse that stood until the 1950s, its later years. Pretty progressive. They had 2 fire engines. You guys don't mind if I tell this story? Okay. All right. The reason that I say this kind of jokingly is when the Churchtown Union Fire Company organized, they bought a used fire engine from the Union Fire Company in Carlisle. Okay? At the same time, another group called the Bulleye Fire Company shows up with this engine on the left, which is the Bulleye. It was, we don't know where it came from. It's the Churchtown Union Fire Company had the Union's old fire engine, and then this showed up, so they had 2 fire engines in Churchtown. A community of maybe 120 people with no water supply. In 1885, the Union engine, the old Carlisle engine, was sold by the Churchtown Fire Company, and they bought the other engine here that you see as the Rumsey. That was bought from Mr. Rumsey, who owned the Rumsey Fire Engine Company up in Seneca Falls, New York. So the point is that by this point in time, by after 1885, neither of these fire engines was ever owned by the Union of Carlisle. Everybody's okay so far? Now, in 1959, the firehouse started to fall down in Churchtown, and some members of the Churchtown Union Fire Company called the Union Fire Company of Carlisle and said, hey, would you take care of our fire engines? Come get them. The Union Fire Company said, sure, we'll do that. So they loaded up a group of guys, and they went down to take the fire engines out of the firehouse, and they got stopped by the neighbors who wouldn't let them take the fire engines. So they talked to the guys from Churchtown, and they signed an agreement. The Union Fire Company of Carlisle said, we'll take the fire engines from Churchtown, and we'll protect them, but if there's ever another fire company in Churchtown, we'll give them back to you. Promise. Well, that was 1959. In 1977, there's another fire company in Churchtown, and they asked for their engines back. And the Union said, they're our engines. We blew them before you did. We're never going to give our fire engines back to you. They're ours. So the Williams Grove Fire Company, the Churchtown group, took them to court, and they were forced to give their fire engines back. Always assuming that both these fire engines had been owned by the Union of Carlisle, and that's why they were so loyal and protected. Well, the judge gave the engines back, which was a fair thing in terms of the agreement, and the Union of Carlisle had never owned either engine. But they swore because William E. Miller, who was a founding member here, Medal of Honor winner, in 1894 gave a speech that those 2 fire engines in Churchtown are our old fire engines. Mr. Miller didn't know what he was talking about, but he came to be believed. You see where we get in trouble? And anyway, now the 2 organizations get along pretty well. Kind of an interesting story. Carlisle Barracks had a fire company. When the courthouse burned in Carlisle, or the town hall and the courthouse burned in 1845, they came and assisted. I suspect that if they had a fire engine, it was destroyed in 1863 when the barracks was burned down. We do know by 1870 that Carlisle Barracks had another hand engine and another firehouse. And we know from 1879, when the Indian School started, up until 1917, when that went out, they had a hand engine and a hose reel. They bought the hose reel from the Union, and the Indian School had a fire brigade, which I've written an article. One more quick one. I've heard an account that Sharmanstown had a hand engine before 1860. Don't know if that's true. The first report of that surface is in 1940. There's no primary documentation to support it, and I was at first skeptical. But remember the pilot engine from Mechanicsburg in 1830? No one knew about that, or no one had written anything about that until I stumbled upon it in the minutes of the Mechanicsburg Borough Council about 2 years ago. So I would be the last person to stand here and say, because I've never heard of it, it doesn't exist. We just haven't found the information to support it. Now you might remember that Sharmanstown had a big fire in what year? It burned a lot of buildings? Okay, well the big fire the really big fire in Sharmanstown was 1908. That burned like a dozen buildings. They had another fire in 1905 that only burned half a dozen buildings. So after the 1908 fire, then they organized a fire company. Okay? So I don't know if they, did or didn't have that in 1860. By the time of the Civil War, which is kind of where our story ends, those are the fire companies that existed that we know of in Cumberland County. They weren't all active at the time. The Civil War had a big impact on the volunteer fire companies. I can't speak for every organization, but we do know that when the war started in Carlisle, several things happened, and they happened out of the firehouses. One of the first things was there was a militia company organized at the Union Firehouse, the Union Guard. And they anticipated rebel attack. Now the war started, I think, on April 13th. They organized the militia company in the Union on April 16th, figuring that rebel attack was imminent, and they wanted to be able to protect the town, which I find kind of a little bit funny. But on April 21st, there were 3 railroad cars parked along High Street, and 3 companies of troops left Carlisle. 2 of those were captained by people out of the Union, Lemuel Todd and Robert M. Henderson, and the 3rd by Robert McCartney out of the Cumberland Fire Company, and 2 companies of the 30th and 1 company of the 36th, and I might have, 2 from the 30th and 1 from the 36th, were very early. They were part of the Pennsylvania Reserves. They went through the whole war. These guys were the real deal. About 85 people from Carlisle left in each of those train cars, and at the end of the war, the last group that came home, there were 12 of them still walking. They left people at Gettysburg, they left people in Antietam, they left people at the Wilderness, they left people in Andersonville Prison, and those organizations came out of the firehouses. Later in the war, the 130th Pennsylvania, there was 1 or 2 companies organized in Carlisle for the 130th. William Porter of the Empire led one of those companies. He was the captain. He was also a local newspaper editor. There was never a draft in Carlisle during the Civil War. We always exceeded our volunteer quotas, and most of those guys came out of the firehouses. I suspect that Shippensburg, that was less the case. Mechanicsburg, maybe not so much the case because their fire company was fairly new. But they played a big role, so they kind of came full circle. Let me wrap up, and I'm going to go a little bit in the future here, but some interesting statistics, at least to me, but again, I'm one of those 5 or 6 people in the known universe that's really interested in this stuff. First fire companies are listed across the top. Carlisle a little bit earlier because of a little bit bigger town. All about the mid-1830s, early 1830s. When they got water, when they got hydrant systems. Carlisle, as I said, 1854, Mechanicsburg, 1858, Shippensburg, 1886. They had to completely replace it in the early 1900s. Newville in 1896. First steam fire engine in Carlisle. There were 3 companies in Carlisle that had steamers. The first came in 1860, the next 2 in 1870. The Goodwill, the Cumberland, and the Union operated steamers in Carlisle. They all had 2 over the years. They replaced them after about 20 years. Mechanicsburg got its first steamer in 1870. Mechanicsburg operated with a steamer and a hose carriage from 1870 to 1905 through some very major fires. Mechanicsburg got their second steam fire engine in 1905. Newville and Shippensburg never got steam fire engines. They just hooked hose up to the hydrant and squirted water from there. And I got to wondering, why is that? And I'm amazed at how relatively rich Carlisle was, and how relatively poor some of these other towns were. And I got to look and trying to find some numbers that would explain this. And there's 2 numbers here that I think are telling. One is the percentage of female workers in the workforce. And if we look at Newville and Shippensburg, 60% of the workforce was made up of female workers. What's that tell us? And I'm not anti-female here. What that tells us is that most of the manufacturing they had was textile related. It was very low wage work, and it didn't create much wealth. It was discriminatory. Carlisle and Mechanicsburg both had industries, wagon works, spokes manufacturing, foundries, ironworking operations, that created a lot of value and created a lot of wealth. So Carlisle was able to afford steamers. Mechanicsburg was able to afford steam fire engines based on kind of the makeup of the community and the workforce that was there. But Mechanicsburg never got steamers, or never got horses. If you look on the bottom, there were 25 lawyers on average in Carlisle in any given year. The other town only had 3. So if you wanted to get horses, you needed to have a lot of lawyers. Some people might say that you have already part of a horse when you have a lawyer, but I won't go there. I didn't say that either. But I thought those numbers were kind of telling or interesting. Now the other number that's to me kind of interesting here, and we're looking at the OddFellows came at the same time, but when they motorized. Carlisle motorized in 1913, and the only reason Carlisle motorized so early was because horses were so costly. It cost $1,600 or $1,700 a year to feed a horse, well, the 3 horses at the Union. And it was cheaper to buy a fire engine, which was pretty much brand new technology. You know, the first motorized fire engine practical was 1906. They really became kind of workable about 1909, 1910. So Carlisle leaped. This is the first technology that Carlisle didn't wait 50 years to try. Okay. 1913 because it was so much cheaper. Now Carlisle, when they motorized, bought a pump engine, an engine with a pump on it, which was kind of advanced thinking. And when I have the motorized dates, for example, in Mechanicsburg, they bought chemical engines, which had tanks of water with sodium bicarbonate in them, and they were like 35 gallons. When you got to a fire, you poured sulfuric acid into it, and that created carbon dioxide and shot the water out the hose. But once the tank was empty, you were done. Didn't have a pump. So Mechanicsburg, their first motorized engine, they took the horse hose wagon at the Citizens and they put it on a Buick chassis. Their second was a chemical engine, came from Laverne, Wisconsin. They didn't buy their first pumper until 1923. And what's even more telling is they had a steam fire engine that they hand-pulled in Mechanicsburg till 1927. And then they bought a used, obsolete tractor that they put under their steam fire engine, and they used it every day till 1935. It was the last steam fire engine in the Cumberland Valley. They replaced it with a 1935 engine that they didn't replace till, I think it was 1975. Okay? And again, kind of, so that's why parenthetically I have that. Shippensburg motorized in 1920. They bought Model Ts and put soda acids on them. They didn't buy their first pump till 1920s. Newville bought their first motorized fire engine in 1916. Now you'd ask, why would Newville do that? Pretty simple reason, fire. They had a huge fire in Newville that burned, I don't know, 15, 20 stables in the downtown area in 1913. They called the Union's fire engine. In fact, the Union's fire engine had just arrived from the factory, wasn't even in service, and they drove to Newville. They had to stop in West Hill and put the tires on because they fell off. And they got to Newville and they saved the town. And Newville started at that point to agitate to get a motorized fire engine. And they put a bond issue out and the voters voted it down. And they tried again, like 5 or 6 times. Newville was going to buy a fire engine, then they didn't, then they did, then they didn't, then they, you know. And in 1916, they had another major fire in the alleys of Newville and burned out another dozen or so buildings, at which time they bought a motorized fire engine with a pump on it. And that's why Newville got into the motorized fire apparatus business so early. Okay? So that's kind of moving ahead a little bit to the future and what we see. The fire companies, again, reflected the development of the infrastructure in the community. And they developed and represented the ability of the community to recognize the fire problems that they had, the potential that they had. They reflect the ability of the community to raise money. They reflect the community's ability to bring groups of people together, to manage change, to manage progress, and to build the infrastructure, again, in combination with the water system that made kind of settlement practical and realistic. So again, it might not be a terribly exciting subject, and it's kind of hard because we don't have a lot of surviving pictures to make it really exciting, but each town evolved differently. When you sit back and you read about the fires and the deaths and the destruction, it's amazing what they got away with for how little they had. Every time Mechanicsburg had a fire, they would call Harrisburg, and Harrisburg would take their fire apparatus down to the railroad station and load it on a flat car and run it across the river over into Mechanicsburg and unload their fire apparatus and help Mechanicsburg put their fire out. They had one fire engine, one steamer from 1870 to 1905. Finally, in 1903, they had 2 major fires, and then they bought the second steamer 2 years later. It took them a while to find the cheapest one, I guess. But in any event, the fire companies, as I said, were at first kind of belittled, later praised, now a little noted. They reflect our country in its youth. They reflect our towns in their youth. And they reflect small groups of people doing their best to do what they could to protect the communities from fire. So that's kind of what I had. I know it's not the most exciting thing. Can I answer any questions, or anybody have any comments? Yes.
How did you mark a house to indicate that they were paying the fire company?
Good question. That's a myth.
Myth.
It's absolutely a myth. No insurance company ever paid a fire company for putting out a fire. They might have made donations. The fire marks were just advertisements. But we've come to believe that that indicated I had paid, but that was never the case. It was never the case. The only, and I won't even say it's true then, the Union Fire Company in Philadelphia later started an insurance company, and in their bylaws, which the Union Fire Company in Carlisle used the same initial bylaws, said, if we go to a number of buildings that are all on fire at the same time, we'll take care of our members first. So if they would see their plaque, if that ever happened, they would have focused on that house before your house if you weren't a member. But other than that, the fire marks are a myth.
So there were plaques on the houses?
There were plaques on the houses, but that's kind of like you bought a policy from State Farm, they gave you a plaque here, hang us on your house and advertise for us. But we come to believe that they represented payments, right? Good question. Yes?
What about Boiling Springs? There is a little firehouse, little building. So what?
Yeah, that was about 1906. There was a fire, and they decided they should do something, so they bought a used chemical fire engine, a hand pull, four-wheel, and the wheels actually hang in the rec room at the firehouse in Boiling Springs now. They bought that around 1906. They had a firehouse, a two-story red building. Is that?
3rd Street.
3rd Street, okay. And that's where the chemical was. That's kind of interesting. Now, when you have a fire produces heat. If the fire's producing more heat than you put water, water absorbs heat. So if the fire's producing more heat than you can put water on it, the fire won't go out. So Boiling Springs buys this used chemical engine, and they bring it to town, and they're going to do a test of it. So whoever built the fire so huge that the chemical engine couldn't put it out. So everybody thought, oh, this chemical engine's a humbug. No, it has capability. You set the fire above that. That organization became somewhat inactive by about 1922 and turned the assets of the fire company over to the Civic Association. There was a civic group at that point in time. By the 1930s, it was stored in a barn at the Kruger Farm where the Carlisle High School is now. It existed, I think, into the 50s, maybe later. As I understand, the legend is, and this isn't any primary source information, that the wheels of that were saved and turned into the light fixtures in the social room at the South Middle Township Fire Company on Forge Road now. So that did exist. It went out of business by about 1922 or so. And we know that because by 1930, late 20s, early 30s, they were asking Carlisle to provide fire protection. In 1931, when the union started their rural service, they signed a contract with South Middle to provide protection, and we see no further mention. And there were some pretty significant fires in that time period, and no mention of the chemical. But it was used a couple times. And it did work if the fire wasn't bigger than what it was capable of. But
There's a little red building on Walnut Street. Is that not the fire? That's not the firehouse? Walnut Street.
yeah, and that's the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, Walnut.
Near where the sinkhole was, where the house fell in.
Yeah, that's right across the street.
Yeah, that's Walnut Street. That was what I'm told, Richard, am I correct, was the old firehouse? And then there was another one on 3rd Street. Now, they formed a fire company in World War II, 1943. The Boiling Springs Fire Company formed. They had a 2-story wooden building. That was on 3rd Street. That was later torn down and became a 1-story building, kind of modernistic. It still stands. But that's the World War II Fire Company. The other one was the 1906, 1908 rendition of that. Yes?
Did Magdalene's have like a fire department?
Yes, they did. Probably more a fire brigade. They owned, and I'm not sure of the years, what was probably, here's the thinking, now this is speculation. During World War II, the whole thought process of World War II and fire protection is pretty interesting. We prepared for a lot that never happened. And one of the things that civil defense anticipated was firebombing in the United States. So in virtually every community, they organized auxiliary firemen. And in many cases, they built auxiliary fire engines. One of the towns that did that was Mechanicsburg, and they got a chassis, we think it's probably a Dodge, and they had surplus or a military skid mount. It had a motor and a pump on it and a water tank that they built in 1943. I think that that ended up as Maslin's fire engine. There's a picture of that here under Maslin's, and they would have had a fire brigade to go to that. Now, I've never found any more information on it. I should probably try and research that while there's still some people around when that was.
How long did that fire department or brigade last in Maslin's?
Not past 1970, I would say, only because I was around in the 70s, it didn't exist then. So I would guess that it was probably post-war, like probably 1946, 48, maybe into the 50s, and then, but that's again kind of speculation.
Did they respond to any fires in the town itself?
To my knowledge, no. To my knowledge, no. I've never seen any reference to that, never seen any pictures, and never heard it talked about, and never in any of the conversations with any of the old guys, the people that were my age then, did we ever hear mention of it. Okay, now, there's other stuff that happened like that, but to my knowledge, it never came off the facility. It's something that would be interesting to research, and I need to do, I mean, it's on my list. Any other questions, comments? Okay, if not, thanks.